Now that we have the background appearing in the top section of the document, it's now time to add the links. And if we come back to Photoshop to take a look at the layout, let me go ahead and zoom out here for a moment. When we zoom out, we can see that we have About, Advertise, and Login. And then over on the right-hand side, we have the Facebook and Twitter icons. Again, if we come back over here, we can also see that the underline has been removed from the link, but then we have an example of what the hover should look like, and in this case, the hover should reveal an underline. So what we need to do is come back into Dreamweaver and set this up so we can add this content to the top portion of the site. So I'm going to switch back to Dreamweaver, and inside of Dreamweaver, the first thing that we want to do is take a look at some of the classes that the F2FW framework gives us. So I'm just going to quickly expand this section that I collapsed earlier. And again, the code isn't the easiest to read. So you may want to do a find and replace. Control F or Command F on the Mac will give you that ability. What we're looking for is a class called .fl. And if you go ahead and click Find Next, it should highlight it for you right over here. And you'll notice what it's doing is it's applying a float left. There's also another class called FR, which does essentially the opposite. It applies a float right. And finally, there's one more class that we're going to be using that clears both the left and the right. And we'll take a look at that when we get there. But if you're not familiar with floats, you may want to take a look at our Dreamweaver course or our CSS3 layouts course. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. I just wanted to point out that these classes exist within the F2FW framework. So when we make reference to them, you'll know exactly what they are. They're not things that we're going to set up. They're things that are already set up for us. So I'm going to go ahead and recollapse that because we don't need it. Before we worry about the CSS portion of it, we need to go in and make sure that we have this content within our HTML document. So come back to index.html, and inside of the index document, what I'd like you to do is get rid of any placeholder text or break or paragraph elements that you added so we could see that background image. Remove those, and we want to start placing this content within the container div. So inside the container div, what we want to do is set up a couple different anchor elements. So go ahead and open up the anchor tag. The href attribute will just be linked to a # for now as a placeholder. And what we want to do is add the title attribute as well. And again, for the title, we're just going to use the # as a placeholder. After that, you can close off that tag and type in the first link, which is About. And again, if you're not familiar with the links, you can always come back to the monoplate layout inside of Photoshop. So we have About, Advertise, and Login. Those are the 3 links that we need to create. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this to save a little bit of time, and then I'm going to paste it 3 times. And I'm going to change About, obviously, to Advertise. So I'll go ahead and type that in. And we also want to change the third About to Login. So that sets up the navigation on the left-hand side, but we need to float it. So all we have to do here is surround these elements with a paragraph tag. And this paragraph tag is going to have a class attribute of FL, which is that float left class that's included in the F2FW framework. So here's this paragraph tag. We just want to wrap our links. And once we're done with that, that sets up the left-hand side of the navigation. What we want to do is set up the right-hand side of the navigation. So in this case, we're going to add another paragraph element. We're going to use the class attribute, and we're going to type in FR to float this to the right. I'll go ahead and close off the paragraph element, and then we can start adding the content that we want to add, which really is the same thing. It's those anchor elements. Except here, instead of having About, we're going to have Facebook. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we're going to paste it. And I'm just going to change this to Twitter. So that looks good. We have this structure in place now. We have the float left and the float right. You can go ahead and save the HTML document. Once you save the HTML document, it's important to understand inside the style.css document and inside of all of this code that the F2FW framework provides for us, there's another class called CL, and it simply applies a clear both. And again, if you wanted to come in and take a look at this, you could try searching through the code for it, but your best bet, again, is to do a find and just type in CL and do a find next. It should highlight it for you. It's way up here. It's actually highlighting articles, so that's not it. I'll do another one. That's still not it. It's down a little bit within the document, but right here you can see it .cl, and it applies a clear to both sides. So now that we know that that exists, we're going to be using that inside the HTML document. So go ahead and close this dialog box, come back to the index page, and underneath this paragraph element, we want to add another div element. And in this case, the div element is going to have a class of CL. And we can go ahead and close off that div container. So there we go. We've applied a float left and a float right and a clear for the container element within the top portion of the HTML document. So in order for us to continue with this and style the text, we need to come into our style.css document and apply a few styles to control the appearance of those elements. So before we look at this in a web browser, what I want you to do is save it, come back into style.css. You may want to collapse all this code, again, added by the F2FW framework. I'll go ahead and collapse it. And what we want to do here is create a few more selectors. The first thing that we want to do is reference top, but more specifically, we want to look at a paragraph element within the top ID. If we find that, we want to go ahead and set the font. First of all, we want to set it to normal, so I'll go ahead and type that in. After typing in normal, you want to add a space and set the size. We're going to set it to 14 pixels. Then you're going to add a / for the leading or the line spacing. I'm going to go ahead and type in 18 pixels. Then we need to add the font family. And in this case, we're going to use that Marvel font that you installed on your system. Right now, we're just going to go with Marvel. We don't have to worry about adding the @FontFace declaration. We will, but for right now, to move things along, I just want to add this manually. Obviously, once we move it to a server, we're going to have to deal with the fact that that font doesn't exist on most systems. But for right now, we won't worry about the @FontFace declaration. We'll get there. So there's the font family. We want to go ahead and add a padding property as well. In this case, we're going to set it to 12 pixels and 0. And again, if you're not comfortable with this shorthand notation, I would highly recommend checking out our CSS course. And then we want to set a margin property of 0. So that's for the top paragraph element. What we want to do is create another selector, but this time for the top section. But within the top section, there's going to be a paragraph element, and within that element, we're going to have our anchor tag. So we're getting pretty specific here with these selectors. What we want to do is set the text decoration to none. Remember, what that's going to do is it's going to remove the underline that by default appears on any hyperlink. And we're doing that because that's what the PSD file calls for. So after setting the text decoration, we're going to go ahead and set the margin property. We're going to use, again, some shorthand notation. We're going to set it to 0, 20 pixels, 0, and 0. And then we want to set a color. So go ahead and type in color, and we're going to use a hex code here. Remember, you could use whatever you want. You could use RGB values. I think it's going to be a little bit easier to use a hex code. Now, we could go into Photoshop and sample the color to get the hex code. It just so happens that I know it, so we don't have to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and type in A0, A0, A0. After typing in that value, terminate it with a semicolon. We're good there. The only thing that we really need to do is we need to add the hover pseudo selector to this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'll come down here and paste it. And we're going to add the hover pseudo selector. Remember, we want the underline to appear when the end user hovers over that text. So we're going to set the text decoration property to underline. And finally, the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the color. We're going to set it to black so we can use a shorthand notation there of just 3 zeros. So once you're done doing that, you can go ahead and save the document. return back to the index page. If you currently have it open in your Chrome browser or your Safari browser, just go ahead and refresh. I'm just going to go ahead and choose Preview here inside of Dreamweaver. When we preview it, you'll notice that the background gradient is there, and now we're seeing these hyperlinks, this text content that was visible inside the Photoshop file. So let's just quickly take a look at the Photoshop file. I'll just tab back to that. You can see now that what we have inside of the browser pretty much matches what we're looking at here inside of Dreamweaver. Of course, we're not done, because if we scroll over to the right, you'll notice we don't have text links here, but rather images. So that's what we're going to begin to address in the next movie.